Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you, Bill, for that wonderful introduction to the riffle crest thalweg and its uses in river hydrology. I'm a recent master's student graduate at HSU, and I'm now working with Bill, Tresh, and Allison O'Dowd at the River Institute as a researcher. And today I'm going to talk to you about using the riffle crest thalweg to quantify ecological risk in the South Forkfield River. So this idea is all about providing a way to link river and stream hydraulics to hydrology and ecology. We utilize the real-time streamflow data from USGS gauging stations and relate it to the riffle crest thalweg depth as a hydraulic control. And with that information, with that riffle crest thalweg curve, we can identify flows and dates that correspond to life stages and habitat use. And then with that information, we can assess risk through time to life stage success for a given aquatic species during a recession limb or over different diversion rates. And as Bill said, I'm going to provide an example for you guys with Pacific lamprey reds and their risk to dewatering and making it to their next life stage. So I collected some data at a study site near the Miranda USGS Gage in Humboldt County, Northern California. Bill coined this hydraulic unit the four turkeys hydraulic unit because he ran into four wild turkeys one day when he was out there working. And this is a picture of the site taken earlier this fall in September. And marked on the blue X in the river is the riffle crest thalweg that provides the hydraulic control for this unit. So jumping right into the methods, there's three major components to this approach. First, we relate the streamflow to RCT depths. Then, with that information, you can identify ecological streamflows or ecologically relevant streamflows. And then with that information, you can then quantify streamflows with risk to life stage success. So in the first major step, we first have to have several measurements of riffle crest depths at a range of different streamflows. And then with that, you can construct your RCTQ rating curve. And for the four turkeys unit, this is what the rating curve looks like. We were able to get 6 points of measurement. And the equation of the curve, as Bill described, is a power function that acts similarly to a Weir equation. And just to describe the way this relationship works a little bit more, as the flows and the RCT depth decrease, the hydraulics become more and more controlled by bed form and riffle crest. And then right near about 0.5 RCT depth, which corresponds to about 40 CFS flow rate, the riffle crests have complete sectional control, acting very similar to a hydraulic weir. Okay, so once you have that RCTQ rating curve constructed, you can then use that curve to identify your ecological streamflows. The first step in that is measuring the elevation of your ecological features relative to the elevation of the stream bed at the riffle crest thalweg. So the ecological features that I'll be presenting to you are lamprey reds that were previously constructed this year. So with those elevation measurements, with the difference in those elevations, you can compute the RCT depth at those ecological features. And then using your rating curve, you can compute the streamflow that corresponds to those depths. And then once you have an actual streamflow associated with those lamprey reds, for example, then you can look up the date of that discharge in the USGS data. So taking a closer look at how we make these measurements in the field, it's kind of like what I like to call river forensics. So this picture was taken at the Four Turkeys hydraulic unit, looking downstream at the right bank. And while you're out there, you have your forensics hat on, and things start to appear, like the silt band. It forms the top and bottom lines. And by surveying in the elevation of those relative to the RCT elevation, we were able to estimate about a 450 CFS flow at the bottom and about 1,500 flow rate at the top of the silt band. And then similarly, pictures make it really difficult to see lamprey reds in the gravel bed, but they're actually quite distinguishable in person. And so you can start to see those in certain areas. And then using the same methods, you can associate flow rates with the elevation measured and surveyed in at those lamprey red features. So I found this picture and I wanted to include it because it's a really nice picture of a lamprey on its red, constructing it. And just I think it's important to have a good idea of what this sort of process looks like. And so, of course, the measurements that I made in the field were elevation measurements near the upstream rim of the lamprey red. So, knowing that these fish require more depth to actually build their reds and do their spawning, I added about half a foot to those associated RCT depths from the lamprey red elevation measurements. And so after adding adequate depth for red building and spawning, I was able to plot those depths associated with each lamprey red on the RCTQ rating curve, and each of the black dots along the curve represent a lamprey red. And so with this, now you have a streamflow associated with each lamprey red during its time of construction. And so at that point, I went back to the hydrograph and looked at the corresponding flows that I associated with each lamprey red and figured out where they fell along the hydrograph since the most recent flood peak, which for this instance was on April 7th at about 25,000 CFS. And then taking a closer look at that recession limb, downloading the data and plotting it, I was then able to plot the flows associated with each lamprey red location along that hydrograph recession limb. And that's what this looks like. So then I have not only a flow rate associated with each red location, but also a date. And so it's interesting to have that time range associated with when these reds are being constructed. For example, there were 9 reds constructed between April 10th and 26th earlier on during the higher flows. There were 11 reds I measured that were constructed between early May and early June, around 1,000 to 200 CFS. And then there were none constructed after early June or anywhere less than 200 CFS. And then there is that outlier way up high. That was a brave soul that constructed its red somewhere over 10,000 CFS. That estimate around 14 might be a little bit high because the curve changes when flows get that high. So with the final step in these methods, with this information, I was then ready to quantify risk to dewatering of these reds. So the first step in doing that is identifying the RCT depth flow where those reds become dewatered. and then I can look up the date associated with that dewater stream flow on the hydrograph data. And then count the number of days from when that bed was constructed to when that bed becomes at risk of dewatering, and compare that number of days of inundation to the number of days required for egg incubation and hatching. So this is what that graph looks like with the risk analysis. As you might imagine, the reds constructed earlier in the year during those super high flows were at a much higher risk than those constructed later on during lower flows. Knowing that it takes about 20 days for eggs to hatch, I designated the earlier constructed reds as having high risk because I was able to calculate those as having either less than 10 or less than 20 days inundated. And then there were several more reds that were constructed and had about 20 to 30 days of inundation, and those were determined to have a moderate risk. And then there were about 9 or 10 reds that were constructed where I estimated they had more than 40 days of inundation, and so I considered those to have no risk of dewatering. So as you may imagine, these risk thresholds can change with change in recession rates. So as another little exercise to show how that works, I plotted the estimated stream flows at these Lamprey reds along last year's hydrograph recession limb. And because the recession rate in 2017 was much more gradual than this year's recession rate, there were more days of inundation for these reds constructed on the 2017 hydrograph. And so therefore there was less risk to dewatering before those eggs could hatch, presumably. So then comparing the risk between recession rates among different years, you can do a similar thing when you have known diversion rates. So when you can plot the change in depth or your change in flow rate against the number of days that are associated with high to low risk for subsequent life stage success. And then you can quantify that level of risk with increasing diversion or with different recession rates. And then this can be a very useful tool for water allocation management. So in conclusion, and also for future considerations, requirements for this approach include RCT depth measurements over a range of different flows, river forensics observations, and doing these things over multiple hydraulic units. Now, the data I presented to you today was just over one unit, but there's potential to do it over multiple, and we have been working on that. And so then we can get an associated range of dates and flows with certain ecological features. And the potential for this analysis is great, in my opinion. You can quantify risk over time with number of days as your unit to life stage success. You can do it across a range of recession flow rates over different years, and you can do it across a range of different diversion rates. And then you can also use this method to identify dates and different stream flows that correspond to other ecological processes, such as with BMI emergence, willow and alder seedling establishment, or low flow side channel habitat for juvenile Chinook salmon. Just a few examples. And then other things, limitations to this analysis and things to incorporate in the future include temperature data, as that can play, as you all know, can play a very important role and sometimes override other variables. And then also associating the Riffle-Crest-Thoway curves with different stream types for the potential of extrapolation and regional management. So with that, that's all I have.